Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Teen Wolf Guide. After the groundbreaking revelations of the last episode, our characters are grappling with a lot of ugly truths, with many more to come. This is Season 1, Episode 10, Co-Captain. Following the events of the previous episode, the lacrosse team wins their game, advancing to the state championships. Scott, with the fear of the Argents in his mind, is searching for Styles, who we know got caught up in an unfortunate discovery.
You must be Styles.
Allison and Scott have a brief but polite encounter, a far cry from Allison's tearful rejection in Wolfsbane. Jackson follows up on his threat from the previous episode and gives Scott 3 days to get him the bite. If he succeeds, then Jackson will help Scott take Allison to the winter formal, with a nice sprinkling of sexism.
And also think about all the things you were able to do to get her some tight little dress by the end of the night.
Back in the locker room, Danny rubs shoulders with Scott, a nice extension of that moment when he defended Scott back in Lunatic. And if this were filmed in 2020, they obviously would have made out by now. Not long after, Scott is ambushed by Derek and Peter Hale, our recently revealed alpha. And it's baffling that Derek would help Peter when we all know now that Peter killed Laura.
It was a mistake.
What?
It happens.
But I do want to point out this interesting trio of Derek, Peter, and Scott. We've covered many times before how Derek is a reflection of Scott, and it's not impossible to point out that Peter fits that mold too, a kind of representation of Scott's uncontrollable, animalistic side. But then there's also the story and power that ties them together, how Peter brought Derek and Scott both back into this world, and how he needs them both to maintain that power. I really like this exchange between them.
We really just want to help you reach your full potential. By killing my friends. Sometimes the people closest to you can be the ones holding you back the most.
Scott versus his true potential and what that potential will lead him to be is a major running theme throughout the show. But this scene also reminded me of the conversation between Allison and Kate back in Wolfsbane.
Allison, if you can give me just a little bit of time, I think I can give you exactly what you want.
I also see these two lines as reflections of each other.
It wouldn't turn me into a psychotic killer.
If they're holding me back from becoming a psychotic nut job like you, I'm okay with that.
And as I wrote this, it also reminded me of a similar pair of lines.
You don't have to be psychotic to be a killer.
We're predators. You don't have to be killers.
There's something to be said about how Scott's arc is trying to fight that instinct to be a killer, whereas Allison's arc might be pushing her toward being one. Anyway, Peter pulls a neat trick that allows him to share his memories of his coma with Scott. We will add this to the Book of Werewolf lore, though it won't reappear for a while. What we learn is why, and perhaps how, Peter became the Alpha. In short, revengeance. We already know that he killed Laura to steal her alpha power, thank you for a non-mangled clip of the character, and we know that Peter is on his way to kill Kate Argent too. But it also explains why he killed the bus driver and those men in the woods. They all, in some way, were responsible for the Hale House fire. And there it is, the villain, his motivation, and his endgame. I appreciate how simple this plot is, even if it was revealed to us in a very complex way. I completely believe that Peter, despite knowing nothing about him before the fire, could become the Alpha. And I also appreciate how it reflects the themes throughout this season, about Scott's identity crisis, about Allison's fear and her family history. It's this plot that, in my opinion, makes Season 1 one of the tightest and strongest written seasons of the show. And with all that, we return to Scott and a very familiar tune. Across town, Allison dreams of Scott and realizes that her precious family heirloom is missing. Not that we would know anything about that. On the search, Allison accidentally overhears a conversation between Kate and her dad, implying that it's past time Chris Argent teach his daughter about the family business. And to push her further in that direction, Kate leaves behind an arrowhead for Allison to discover. Meanwhile, Jackson is on a joyride the next morning. His car breaks down. Chris Argent is conveniently around to help him out, and Chris tries to not so subtly find out more about Jackson's scratch. But before Chris can get really threatening, look who's here to save the day.
Yo, what's up?
Chris reveals to the audience that he had tampered with Jackson's car last night and slumps away like a Scooby-Doo villain.
I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for you meddling kids.
Scott confronts Jackson, berating him for almost revealing everything about Scott and the werewolves, and as much as Jackson tries to bluff, he can't deny that he felt Scott's fear in that moment.
When they come after you, I won't be able to protect you. I can't protect anyone. Why are you looking at me?
Why do you think? And there's a nice line here from Scott that acts as an answer to a question Derek posed all the way back in Wolf Moon.
Is it really so bad, Scott, that you can see better, hear more clearly, move faster than any human could ever hope?
Yeah,
I can run really fast now. Except half the time, I'm running away from people trying to kill me!
Ultimately, Jackson blames Scott for failing to master his abilities. To put it simply,
Me? I drive a Porsche.
in the woods, Allison's excited to test out her new arrowhead. Lydia's extremely out of her depth and is confronted about her recent transgression.
It's not like I would take him to the coach's office during lacrosse practice to make out with him or anything.
When Allison shoots the arrowhead, she's surprised and intrigued at its power. It's a moment that quietly pushes her further along her character path. Then the girls hear a noise, and Allison, emboldened by the past few minutes, checks it out on her own. This scene has never sat well with me. Knowing what I know about the future and how this season contributes to that future, I'm honestly uncomfortable with how easy it is for Allison to step into this role as a hunter. Of course, that doesn't mean these scenes aren't also a way for her to reclaim that power and deal with the fear and helplessness she felt from the events of night school. Which is all to say that it's important for Allison to feel powerful, but it's unsettling to those she holds power over. Even this particular scene, with no future context, is off to me. This whole time, Scott's perspective has framed the hunters as dangerous and cruel, so seeing Allison get excited about shooting the same arrowhead that Chris shot to almost kill Scott is hard. I think the further we go into this show, the better I'll be able to understand my feelings in all this. In the meantime, this beautiful shot of Allison exploring the woods leads her to Scott, where he feels the wrath of her power.
Scott?
It turns out Allison didn't have to worry about losing her necklace because Scott had found it. And this dialogue brings us back to those polite but awkward feelings between these two. They're not quite together, they're not quite friends, but they can't stay away from each other. And those are hard, complex feelings to deal with. But I'd safely say that the ball is now in Allison's court. There's something so goofy about seeing Stiles by himself, being himself, in the comfort of his own home. The sheriff, as he has been all season, is preoccupied with the mystery of Derek Hale. Derek's eyes, and by extension all werewolf eyes, are so bright that they flash in pictures, a feature we'll revisit later. The sheriff also reveals, as we learned earlier, that all the recent victims of the Alpha were somehow connected to the Hale house fire. The men in the woods, the video store clerk, and the bus driver. But the real thread in this scene is the growing distance between Stiles and his dad. The sheriff has more questions than answers about the number of attacks and deaths in Beacon Hills, and Stiles, for all that he does know, can only sit back and watch. In the same way that Scott has shut out his mom, Stiles can't let his dad in. The quiet stillness of this scene is made sharper by the mention of Stiles' mom, Claudia Stilinski. We've only just begun to understand the impact that Claudia's death has left on Stiles and his dad, but nonetheless, that weight is heavy. Back at the McCall house, Scott faces the consequences that being a werewolf has had on his normal life, through his slipping grades. Allison, to his surprise, has finally answered Scott's peace offering. As Allison starts to reveal the secrets she's been uncovering about her own family, and her own questions about the supernatural, it seems like Scott might finally get to tell her the truth. But the two are cut short by Melissa, who reveals that she's been asked out on a date by none other than Peter Hale. It's an obvious move to threaten Scott, and he's forced to abandon his conversation with Allison to go save Melissa. With some quick thinking, Scott and Stiles are able to intervene before Peter attacks Melissa, but the message is clear. As long as Scott resists Peter's advances to join his pack, Peter will continue to put those closest to him in danger. And apparently, Jackson is one of those people. Once again, Derek corners him at the school.
You know what? You haven't had a day in your whole life where you haven't been afraid of something.
But this time, Derek is ready to give Jackson what he wants. The bite. There's a curious through line between Scott and Peter and Jackson and Derek. While Scott rejects Peter, Jackson willingly walks into Derek's world. In the beginning of this episode, Jackson claimed that he would handle the bite better than Scott, and if this moment is the chance to prove it, then Jackson completely fails. Because once Derek reveals just how dangerous his world is, Jackson is just like Scott on the night of his bite, alone and afraid. But this time is different. Scott arrives just in time to confront Derek and protect Jackson. Before they can get too far, however, all three are attacked by Kate, who was tracking them earlier in the episode. Derek, in a moment of clarity, realizes Scott's been shot and takes the gunfire so that Scott can escape. Scott manages to escape into the woods, but he's heavily wounded and passes out, unable to meet back with Allison and help her understand the truth about the supernatural. At the same time, Allison receives a text from Kate, and tired of waiting for Scott, heads out to meet her. Almost like this simple miscommunication is going to be the root of trouble going forward, huh? But when Scott is resigned to his fate to die in the woods, he's unexpectedly picked up and taken care of by Dr. Deaton. Yes, that Deaton, the guy who was kidnapped and heavily implied to be the alpha, only to turn out to be a totally oblivious victim. Or so we thought. How much does he know? Is he a friend or a foe? For now, it looks like he's on Scott's side. And finally, to close out the episode and kickstart the final events of the season, to tie up the mystery that was kicked off for a young Allison Argent who found herself with more and more questions with each passing episode, Kate finally has an answer. And that answer is Derek Hale, tied up and wolfed out. There's a few points I want to touch on, but overall, Co-Captain is a quiet meditation before the two-part finale. Honestly, not much happens, which is maybe the right choice after the game-changing reveals in Wolfsbane. We don't have any better of an idea why Kate set the Hale house on fire, and Scott's interactions with Peter only prove that he's just getting started. Instead, it's the ties between the characters that we focus on. Scott and Allison, Scott and his mom, Stiles and his dad, and Scott's growing moral compass, his sense of leadership and responsibility that doesn't quite define him as a hero, but is certainly on its way.
I can't protect anyone.
So perhaps this episode serves to remind us of the relationships that are at stake. Sure, Scott's double life could be exposed, but more importantly, his loved ones are in danger. The town is in danger. After all, if you don't understand the stakes, then there's no reason to root for Scott and his friends to win the day. Earlier in the episode, Peter makes an observation that Native Americans were the originators of lacrosse, and this is, as far as we know, pretty accurate. Lacrosse in its original form was a popular game between nations across North America, and while different Native American cultures have influenced the show, I've always found it disappointing that there are very few, if any, Indigenous actors on the show. Having characters that reflect the influences on the character of the show itself always makes a stronger statement. Finally, even though Jackson and Allison have officially diverged from parallel paths, they still carry the same story beats. Most notably, as Derek takes Jackson in, confirming all of his suspicions about the supernatural and almost giving him the bite, Kate is across town essentially doing the same thing to Allison. I also noticed that while in the Hale house, Jackson remarks that he dreamed of this house, of the fire. While Derek is shocked and perhaps provoked, the audience understands that this is a remnant of Derek's memories, transferred to Jackson when Derek scratched him with his claws. Following the parallel, it would have been interesting if Allison somehow had dreams or experiences that were actually remnants of Kate's. But the pieces are in place, and the endgame is starting. Peter's final bid to make Scott join his pack, Kate's reckoning with the sins of her past, and our characters' confrontation with the legacy of Beacon Hills are all mysteries that are about to be solved. I'll see you in the next one.